Hello, everyone. My name is Bert Correa, and I'm joining today from New York City. I'm Taino, a descendant of the indigenous people from the Northern Caribbean islands. My family's from Puerto Rico, but I was born and raised in the borough of the Bronx. I work on an amazing education team as the Assistant Teacher Services Coordinator at the National Museum of the American Indian. In today's session, we'll meet two people, Michael Sheyahshe and Dr. Lee Francis IV, who helped us in the creation of the new permanent exhibition, Native New York, which is housed at the National Museum of the American Indian here in New York, as well as with related lessons about the early encounters in Native New York. Did Native people really sell Manhattan? They have also supported the work of our national education initiative, Native Knowledge 360. In developing the exhibition and the digital lesson, the museum was looking for a way to connect young people with our messages through imagery. The lesson and the exhibition work to break stereotypes about Native people and histories was part of that plan. Generally, Native people are often represented as living in the past tense and usually in a rather stoic or serious way. The idea of integrating comic displays in the exhibition and hand-drawn and animated images in the lesson plan appealed to wide audiences because it was both visually exciting and accessible. It was also a way to connect a contemporary medium to historical content and tell difficult and often absent stories in compelling ways. Today, we're joining from both the National Museum of the American Indian in New York City, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution, a complex of museums, libraries, a zoo, and research centers, as well as from Washington, D.C. on the National Mall. Our collection is housed in the Cultural Resources Center in Suitland, Maryland. The exhibition, Native New York, which you'll hear mentioned, is the newest permanent exhibit at the National Museum of the American Indian in New York. There's online lessons that accompany this exhibition as well. Here you'll see the landing page of NK360, our national education initiative to transform teaching and learning about Native Americans. We'll add a link to the chat as well as a follow-up email containing that link and other resources. I've had the opportunity of working with Michael and Lee before and had a great time. I know you'll enjoy the conversation moderated by our colleagues from NMAI, Jen Shannon. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Jen. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Shannon, a curator and manager of community engagement programs at the National Museum of the American Indian. I also co-produce a comic series that tells true stories about repatriation. It's my honor to be speaking with two of the artists who helped conceive the stories in the Native New York exhibit as graphic panels. Michael Sheyahshe is a member of the Caddo Nation. He has 2 bachelor's degrees from the University of Oklahoma, one in Native American Studies and the other in film. He earned his MFA in 3D modeling from the Academy of Art University. Michael is the author of Native Americans in Comic Books, A Critical Study, and the founder of Alternative Media, an Indigenous-owned business that provides custom, creative, and technical solutions, ranging from graphic novels to interactive 3D simulations. Michael has written comic stories for the first 3 volumes of Moonshot, the Indigenous Comics collection, and served as a cultural consultant for Dark Horse Comics. Dr. Lee Francis, our other guest, is a member of Laguna Pueblo. He earned his PhD from Texas State University. He's the head indigenerd and CEO of Native Realities, the only Native and Indigenous pop culture company in the United States, founded with the hope of changing perceptions of Native and Indigenous people through dynamic and imaginative pop culture representations. He is co-founder of Red Planet Books and Comics, now ATCG, or A Tribe Called Geek, in Albuquerque. It is the only Native comic shop in the world. ATGC is also the headquarters for the IndigiPopX Expo and Convention. Dr. Francis has published in multiple genres, from poetry to short stories. I will be speaking with both artists about their work and their approaches in the exhibition and lesson. Welcome, Michael and Lee. Thank you so much for taking time to share your thoughts and experiences with us today. In our first conversation together, we'll be focusing on issues of representation and how you used comics as a way to address these issues. But I want to first start with the basics and talk to our teachers about what are comics to begin with. If you want to geek out about comics, or if you want a thoughtful introduction to how they work, you can start where I did, which was with Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. He and Will Eisner define comics as sequential art, in a way that the words and the images complement each other, each taking on a part of the storytelling. In my own work, we turn to comics for a few reasons. First, unlike text, you can see who's speaking, which is really important when concerned with issues of representation, and we'll learn a lot more about that today. Second, they're more approachable and reach a far broader audience than academic articles or history textbooks, and can connect across different generations, from kids to elders. And finally, because they include art and visual languages, they can provide opportunities for what some people call Easter eggs, where a subset of your audience has the knowledge to interpret a visual clue in a way that may go unnoticed by the general reader. That's all super compelling for working in this medium. But for me, producing comics was a part of my job as a professor when I started working on academic presentations with Dr. Sonia Atalay in 2016, so super recent. I didn't grow up reading comics, but I absolutely love working in them now. And I would love to hear more about how our guests got started. And I think it's probably been a longer time for them than it's been for me. So Lee and Michael, what about you? When and how did you both get into your work with comics? Michael, would you like to begin?
Sure, thank you. That's a good point. Actually, not only the representation, but Scott McCloud. I got started in comics, and I just, you say it's been a while. I just read one about 5 minutes ago. So I actually get to read several comics on the weekly. So I grew up very removed on the farm in Oklahoma, and so that was the one thing that really allowed me to have a lifeline to the outside world. Unfortunately, though, as you can tell, growing up Native and Indigenous, looking towards who was my heroes, why are they my heroes? I have obviously had Lone Ranger and Tonto and that sort of thing from the thrilling days of yesteryear. But when I looked at the comics, that was what I was questioning: is what makes these Native characters in these comics good?
Lee, what about you? What was your experience?
So I grew up in what I would consider a nerd household. My dad was a big fan of science fiction and fantasy. That was what covered our shelves. He was a voracious reader. So reading and literature was always important in my household. And I think that there wasn't a stigma that was attached in terms of reading comic books like there were in still a number of places, right? For me, my dad just liked it that I was reading, and anything that was, that captured my attention was valued within our house. So, that gave me free range to go find things like a spinner rack. And I think I have a couple of, one of my oldest memories is there's a spinner rack, or there was a spinner rack when I was growing up at Duran Central Pharmacy in Albuquerque. And I used to go be able to pull the Marvel titles that were on there. My favorite, I think at the time, was the Marvel Almanac. Love the Marvel Almanac, because it was you could have all what their powers were, their little encapsulated history at the time of each individual character, and characters you'd never heard of. And, I got into it probably in the 80s. So there's 20, 30, 40 years of Marvel history up to that point. And then slowly started branching out, reading more, you kind of get subsumed in pop culture. So with Batman and, in the movies, I remember going to see, the Tim Burton, Michael Keaton Batman when it came out in the theater in Santa Barbara. So I have a lot of memories that have continued to build on themselves as for why comics were important to me. I remember, going and just finding comic shops when I was a young kid on weekends with my aunt and uncle. They would just be here, be back in a couple hours. And I would just go find a local comic shop and go read. I think one of my earliest jobs was to vacuum a small bookstore. And I vacuumed the store in exchange for comics, right? And I was probably 12 or 13. So comics have always been with me. I think that the visual style, the representations, the action, the art, the artistry of making comics, of reading a comic, I think has always been appealing and compelling to me. And it's been a lifelong passion.
Thanks to you both. And, I know that when we look to sort of these really well-known books like Understanding Comics, it really comes from a Western perspective, right? And I know Lee, you've mentioned this before, is that it's a great place to start, but there's, such a diverse kind of languages and visual languages that are in different types of regional areas, from Japanese manga to even now and published Indigenous comics. And sort of, I want to turn now to Michael's book, because I think that's another place for teachers to start that comes from a different perspective. And that is Native Americans in comic books, and it looks at the representation of Native peoples in this medium through time. And so I'm wondering, Michael, if you can discuss how this project started for you, and if anything surprised you while you were researching and writing this book. I think it's a wonderful kind of balance to this existing literature, and we're just so excited you're here to talk to us about it today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. You touched on a lot of things there, and I'll just kind of make a joke and be done with it. So the surprise was I got done writing it, right? It took a while. It really did. And to that note, I wrote it in college as a 20 or 30 page simple term paper about Native Americans in comics. And from that, it turned into I got a grade on it. I graduated from the University of Oklahoma, and then it just sat there in the drawer. And so there it is there, and Dr. Francis is holding it. Really what you're hearing is what I mentioned. So as I began not only my lifelong journey of self-identity and, identity negotiation and that sort of thing, it really became important to understand what I was looking at and how we as Native people were represented in pop culture, specifically comics, because I enjoyed them so much, right? And even at the time, in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't a whole lot of comic geeks, if you will. There wasn't a whole lot of comic people, or there were, but not as it wasn't as mainstream, right? And with that, on the farm growing up, I had a bunch of buddies that we would read and discuss comics together, and that was fantastic. It gave me something, an outlet, if you will. And in that same way, I began thinking about that term paper that was just sitting in the drawer after college, and very similar to the Telltale Heart, it sort of weighed on me that there was no other first resource by this. And I think that's what surprised me a little bit, right? That there was no other primary resource that outlined someone's view. And I want to be clear here that this is my view. When I wrote the book, it was my interpretation of comics as one Native person. And I want to be careful because way too many times we'll have these ideas and we'll say, this person said this, so, all Indigenous people must think this way, or we can very easily attribute that to a larger culture when indeed we're so varied and different that you couldn't, right? It wouldn't be fair. So in that same respect, writing the book, I just said, okay, let's do it. There's no other primary sources about it. I began looking at my own comics, the 5 or 20 or so that I had gathered when I originally wrote the paper. I was big on eBay at the time. I kept getting all these eBay stacks of comics, hundreds and hundreds of them going through, trying to research a little farther in the past. And within that, I also was able to, thankfully, make contact with a bunch of great artists. And I think that's what surprised me is that all the artists, whether they were Native or non, were so open about the processes, and about what it takes to make comics and what they wanted to. And they were very open to my questions like, why did you make this Indigenous character this way? Why do they have to have fringe? What is going on? And so it was not only surprising, but it was also touching that many people felt as deeply about comics as I did. And it was refreshing to see them answer back in a way that was thoughtful and open and receptive of my queries.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the emphasis on the diversity of community and individual perspectives. I think that's a really lovely thing to keep in mind as we talk about representation today too. So thanks for that. Before we turn to Lee, I think we're going to look out to the teachers and see if they might share with us a little of what they're thinking right now. So teachers, why do you think using graphic novels and comic books might be a good way to teach kids about Native history and culture? You can use the chat to write. We'll have some time and then we'll return back to our discussion. Thanks so much for all of your comments, everyone. We're going to return back to the conversation. And what I really love about this discussion, kind of talking about representations and contemporary experience, is that there are all sorts of people getting into comics now. And there is a new word that I'm excited to share with you, thanks to Lee, which is Lee. You call yourself an indigenerd, which I totally love. And I would love if you could describe what an indigenerd is and how someone becomes one.
Yeah, it's a great term. I think I just took it on as my alter ego, so I call myself Dr. Indigenerd because there's a lot of doctors in the comic book universe, so it's kind of like my superhero profile. Um, for me, I think coming out of this, an Indigenerd is someone that wants to see positive representations of Native people in popular culture. And I think that that's being a champion. So someone becomes an Indigenerd by being a champion for that. You can be Native. I think you can be non-Native as well. We term it for kind of ourselves, but I think, any type of support. You can be a nerd about all sorts of stuff, right? I think there was a framing just for nerddom was that you love something fully, deeply, and unironically. So it's something that you have and a deep knowledge of. So I think there's many folks that are indigenerds out there, whether they admit it or not, because they have a deep understanding. They want to see positive pop culture representation of Native peoples. They want to have, they have this affinity for popular culture and want to see, something new, something that draws upon authentic, traditional elements, that draws upon contemporary, relevant stories of Native identity, and covers things not only just comics, but film and television and games and science fiction and fantasy, all those places where Native folks are usually not represented. And if they are, they're not always represented in the most positive light along the grand scale of pop culture.
Yeah, I love Indigenerd. I love how you're maybe broadening teachers' understandings of who gets involved in pop culture and the kinds of folks that might increasingly be responsible for producing those representations. But we know there's been a long history. And so, Michael, I was hoping you might talk some about the common stereotypes that teachers might see in textbooks and popular media and tell us more about them. And it sounds like these are the kinds of things that Indigenerds and others are working to change.
Yeah, thanks. Let's talk about the stereotypes in general. And many of these are outlined in the book. In fact, I really developed these for the book because I didn't want the book to just be, here's how I feel about this character, here's what this character is. I wanted to be able to compare and contrast them. But what I found a lot of the times is whatever we say in all these long list of things, the idea becomes, is that character represented in a way that is respectful and shows their humanity, right? And some of these stereotypes that I would find is the way the description of that character or the other characters, how they describe that character. Is it demeaning? Do they say, oh, they're just a reckless savage or whatever it is? That's probably not a good stereotype to use, right? Another one, of course, I mentioned Lone Ranger and Tonto was if the Native person or indigenous character talks like Tonto. And it's not a problem, right? But what that does is it identifies as a reader or a consumer of that media that character may not be as intelligent as the other more fluent, English speaking or whatever language you're reading in the comic at that point. There's another one about, the pan-Indianism, if you will. So looking at all tribes as just fringe and feather, sort of Plains Indians type. So it's easy to see, in comics, especially when you have an artist that may not have first world experience with indigenous peoples, that they'll just, throw the character on a horse or make them wear buckskin or such, right? And then, are there ideas or are there belittling sort of commentary or comic interludes that specifically focus on some of the stereotypes that have been known about Native people over the years? For instance, is there a joke about firewater? Not very funny, right? Is there a joke about, oh, he's just a stupid Indian, right? Because that was, again, that sort of milieu of understanding the differences of, say, boarding school education and regular public education. So the one that gets me a lot, and sorry, Hallmark Network or whomever does, but the Lifetime Movie Network is are we portrayed as an extinct species? Meaning, are we only shown in history? Are we only shown through that sort of sepia tone lens of romanticism, if you will, of making that? In that same vein, right? Looking at us, whether we're noble or savage. Do we have to be either? Can't we be a combination of good characters? Can't we understand that we're complex? Again, the stereotypes I began finding then really were ones that I could see where people were trying to tell stories about Indigenous people, but they were still using these shortcuts or crutches. And in some cases, it was just people that would just grab onto something. Another stereotype would be, is the tone patronizing, meaning do other characters talk about this character in a way that feigns respect, right? And that's really easy to do depending on how you're setting up the comic. But most importantly, we want to make sure that we understand the characters need to be complex. They need to be no shortcuts. Usually it'd be better if they were told by us as an Indigenous people. But more importantly, no matter who's writing the story, we want it to be a good character and one that shows our humanity, our complexity. And that was something that was lacking in a lot of them.
So to add to that, I think there's what we see in terms of these, we'll call them late stage representations, are really a collection of things that we've seen, dating back to the 1700s, right? So Native people occupy a very seminal spot in popular culture, and especially American popular culture, from the English to America, to the Americans. The first terminology that's used for Native people comes from the noble savage, right? Which we reference, and that comes from John Dryden's The Conquest of Granada, which was written in the mid 1600s. Early representations and illustrative representations of Native people found their ways into historical records and diaries and whatnot. But even the early sort of cartoons of Native people, early political cartoons, came out in the 1700s, 1763, right around the 1760s. So a lot of these stereotypes are very, very wedded and entrenched in American iconography. We have this sort of noble savage, and I usually point out, there's an image that I always use, but you can see all of them. Is like, this Native guy, he's got a bow and arrow, he's got a parrot, on his finger, he's got he's just ripped, he's got a 12-pack going on, he's got the feathered headdress, just the breechcloth, that's all he's wearing. And I mean, this is still the kind of hyper masculine iconography that we have today, that we really see around the Native identity within comic books, film, and television. You don't see the round and brown, guys like me, right? I was Pueblo, I'm like the tallest Pueblo. There's a lot of short Pueblo folks. We don't show those stories. And I think, to Michael's point, it's not only we want the humanity of each individual person, nation, community, character, history, traditional, but a lot of times it's essentialized down to this particular imagery that has been established and was not established by Native peoples. We didn't have access to the presses. We were too busy trying to survive. So we didn't get the chance to rewrite and retell our stories until this last couple of decades, really, in terms of this growth of Native folks in comic books to push back against many of these stereotypes and things that were established long before we had the chance to respond in a meaningful and visual way.
Well, so I love where it is now, but what do we do with all of those materials from the past, right? So is there a responsible way to look at materials that might have those stereotypical representations, or, what would you advise teachers and others as far as what to do with those existing representations? Do they leave them behind and use new resources? Do they engage with them in some educational, responsible manner? What do you advise? What might that look like?
So I always say under supervision, right? Because to understand that I think is the job of an educator. As an educator myself, when we had our shop fully open, we had our wall of shame. And it was all of these comics from the 50s and 40s and whatnot that had Native people in them, and they're getting punched on the covers, they get punched in the face, or it's the ones that that Michael talks about in his book, was it Firebrand, White Daughter of the Sioux? I think that's a lot of these it's like a white Indian, these types of stories or whatnot. I think they need to be around so that we can talk about why we write the way that we write as Native peoples, because these are the things that were around for us. So I would say it's not necessarily something we want kids to embark on their own, but I think it's important that they, I mean, I'm not about getting rid of this stuff. I just think it needs to be, I think it needs to have some care. I think it needs to have some folks showing some of the nuances. One of my favorite ones that Michael and I have talked about that I got from his book is Tonto's spinoff comic. Right. So we can say everything that we want to about the Lone Ranger and Tonto and the Pidgin English and how Tonto, is always the one that gets sent in to get beat up and all the rest. But his spinoff comic has him speaking perfect phrases in his thought bubbles. It's perfectly, he's incredibly eloquent. So it's about the translation, really, right? Like, there's still things that are problematic, but there's some nuances in there that I think are really key and important to discuss when folks were actually, settling in to write these characters. And, not everything is problematic all the time. It can have a veneer of problems, but there's also things that we can point out that we can really like. I call it a critical nerd theory, right? So it's how do we reconcile as marginalized people and marginalized voices who didn't have the opportunity to write our own stories until very recently. How do we reconcile those nerd things that we really love with the problems in that nerd thing, right? And how are we able to look for the deeper nuances and not just say like, well, this is a problem, I have to get rid of it all, right? I mean, I can say that about Star Trek. There's issues with Star Trek and Native portrayals in Star Trek. Doesn't mean I stop loving Star Trek. Means I don't have to like those episodes, right? I can love the Last of the Mohicans movie, which I do. I love the Daniel Day-Lewis one. And I can still recognize the issues around, like the stuff that comes up around the vanishing or dying, Indian, the issue of transference, right? Like the native guy taking all of the white guy taking all the native ways and then becoming more native than the natives were. Those are still things that I can call out. And I can still say that movie's so awesome when they're running through the forest and he throws the war club at the back of that and they're like doing their whole thing, the last battle with I love that. And I think that's such a great representation of Native people. Yeah, you can hear it. It's the fiddle soundtrack. Bum, bum, it's like going through. And I think so when I look at what we do with this stuff, I think supervision is really good. And also calling out some of the issues and the problems in there help kids become more critically conscious in a much more nuanced way about previous materials to recognize both the importance of it, but also why we're building a newer canon and why it's important to continue to support the work of Native illustrators, writers, storytellers in this work so that we can bridge and continue to move forward.
So if I could just jump in real quick. Sorry. The mention of Star Trek made me want to jump in and talk about what I feel in the Doctor Who, as far as, notice the background and everything. But I like the way that Doctor Who and say even like the Muppets are doing it when they're replaying their episodes on Disney Plus, the app, right? There's an episode with Tom Baker's Doctor Who in the 70s or so, The Talons of Wang Chang, where Chinese characters are shown in London in 17 or 1800s or so. And as you can imagine, they're not shown very well, and there's yellow face, as we would call like blackface or red face. So why do I bring those up? I think as Lee was talking about, Dr. Francis was talking about, there's a really good opportunity here with some supervision to go, hey, enjoy the story. And here, by the way, is some parts that we as a society have changed. So that's a good opportunity to have that dialogue with someone that might understand why that's not okay. Dr. Francis and I and everyone else may have some good understandings because we've done our research and we're Indigenous and everything, but those that don't have our purview, right, may need to have that little message like, hey, buddy, this is not okay anymore, and have a discussion about why. And that's the only thing I wanted to tag on to that. So thanks.
No, I think that's great. It gives people tools to be critical readers, not just of text, but of visual images too. So I think that's all really great. Thank you. Now I would love to look at some good examples of work that's freely available on our website, NK360, specifically at the $24 question comic. Lee, you wrote the text for this, so I'm hoping you can discuss with us some of the decisions you made when coming up with this piece.
Right. Yeah, that was really, that was one of the fun ones. One, I love being able to do the research, right? So, when we first started the project and Michael brought me in to be a part of it, the chance, I mean, I love making comics. that's a no-brainer. But also the chance to learn and be a part of like, a lot of learning about Native New York and this particular question in general, and the research from the research team was really exciting. And so that influenced a lot of how we were looking for the approach of writing this. So we came into it with kind of a question. We had to reorient some things because of the needs for visual, for folks that, for visual reasons and all the rest of that. And so, but the original idea was to sort of follow the narrative around these small, quick bits that would debunk this myth of $24, right? So this idea that Native people sold Manhattan for $24 in beads and trinkets. And I think there were a couple of things that wanted to make sure that we put into the work itself. And great art by Dale DeForest, who did some incredible work on that. One of the things is that we wanted to make sure that the imagery we used the colors that were aligned with the Native New York exhibit. So all of the characters have those colors that are used as part of the color scheme. We wanted them to have sort of like, a vibrancy. So just even thinking about how we wanted to portray it is we didn't want a historicized version of Native folks. We wanted a positive, popular version of Native folks. We wanted to point out one of the most compelling things that was for me and an understanding or a way that I tend to essentialize it now when I'm talking about it is that the Lenape people at the time weren't selling New York, they were leasing New York, right? They had a very sophisticated understanding of trade and negotiations and how you work with that. They had a very sophisticated understanding of territory, but they didn't have a Western concept of ownership, right? This idea that like you can own something. Now, what happens is that gets translated as to that the natives are dummies. They didn't know about ownership, so we swindled them. And so we kind of use it in this twofold way that like natives got swindled is the core part of that sort of terminology and mythology. The natives were too dumb to understand what Manhattan was worth, and so they sold it for beads and trinkets. Ha 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 ha. On the flip side, native folks are like, well, they ripped us off, and we didn't know these beads and trinkets, and natives don't own things, which I also think undercuts the ability, the capacity that the Lenape and many communities and nations at the time had in terms of conducting treaty affairs, in terms of conducting diplomacy and land management, resource management. So that was a lot of my underlying approach, was to write this in a way that would be compelling, but also not only break the mythology of the $24, but break the mythology of Native people not really knowing, not knowing things because we're so primitive and and this is just what happens. So that was a lot of what we put in. Really wanted to, a lot of the editing went in to try and get this down to like 10 words. How do you convey that in like 10 words for one image, one little section? Because if you look at some of the others, we got a lot more dialogue going on. We had just a small bit to really convey that all of these concepts. And I think there's 8 or 12, if I recall correctly, of the little panels that we have. And then finally, the last thing I'll add is when putting it together, I always tend to put like a modern spin or living natives in the work that we do. I don't, this was something that happened that whatever the case is, whether the natives were swindled, which they weren't, they were still forcibly removed. The Lenape were no longer allowed to be in their ancestral and traditional homelands. They were pitched west, right? So there's still this element of strife that goes with the story itself. So what I wanted to point out was, along with Native New York, is that Native folks are still here. It's not about strife. And so that last panel is, Native young people smiling, in that same sort of color palette, standing, in downtown Manhattan, because Native people are still there in Manhattan. The Native people are still here in this space. So I wanted to have all these threads and pieces pulled together for that.
Yeah, and I love the vibrant colors. I love all different manners of expressions on everyone. I think, like you were saying, it's hard to pick the specific scenes that advance a very complex story, but I think it's been achieved really well here. And like you said, I love that idea of people reflecting on the past, not only being presented in the past. So I think that's really powerful. Thanks for sharing that. Well, the next kind of panels I'd love to look at is asking Michael to tell us what is wampum and the intention behind highlighting it, and a factory that makes wampum in the exhibition. So if you could kind of look at the panels with us and tell us a little bit about your decision making.
Certainly. Yeah, just like Lee, I also found out a lot by writing this particular one. It's focused on a couple of members of the Puspatic Reservation, and they have a business entity there that produces wampum. Wampum is, in this case, we'll think of it as the typical adornment of like material and beads on, you would say, a wampum belt or length of cloth, right? But it could also be earrings or rings or other parts. It's a semi-precious stone that really has to be carefully tackled. So as you look at the comic, you can see sort of the day in the life of, and as I was doing the research as well, I had not only the historical research, but understanding I had video to review. I was lucky enough to have photographs of the actual business and see how they actually do things. So there was a couple of things as Dr. Francis and I were looking towards this. We wanted to make sure that, as he said, that we bring the now into it, or that we make sure that the native indigenous presence and characters are real and they have a modernity to them, right? They're in the modern age, right? And in this case, I also wanted to make sure that we had a sense of humor. And those of you that can tell and look at my face know that I'm very funny, right? But we wanted to make sure that we put the native humor in there as well. So as you look at the last panel, there's a little reveal, kind of like a little Easter egg, where she's done all this work, and we show the technicality, the technical parts of it, about how hard it is to drill the beads in some cases, how they can break, how the drill bit can break. But at the end, she's done all this hard work, and we only see just the little teeniest, tiniest little thing, right? But it is gorgeous. So we really tried to infuse some humor into it as well. And that's luckily something I didn't have to explain to the artist, Aragon Starr. She's Kickapoo, and she, obviously understands humor. She wrote Super Indian, the comic book. She does, the radio shows and such. She sings, she dances. I don't know what she does, but at that moment, right, she really got, without me having to explain it, right, the idea of like, oh no, it's just a little teeny tiny thing. So that was very fun. And to her credit, Aragon suggested we use the people we had seen in the images in the video. So the people you see in the comic, I'm proud to say, are actually the people that work there. The male and female characters are related. They're father and daughter, I believe, and they're real people. And we wanted to give them something that we got their permission, but that was exciting to allow their imagery to be portrayed in this as well. But yeah, I got to learn a lot about that particular community, how, quahog is drilled, and how to make wampum. So it was very cool.
And Lee, what do you find compelling about this particular series of panels in this section in the exhibit?
I think, one of the things that I'll second what Michael said. We were really conscious about, again, that this is a celebration and that the exhibit itself is a celebration. It's too often we walk into these spaces of Native identity, and the expectation is that it's about the tragedy. It's about the tragic nature of what happened to Native people. And I'm too much of an optimist. I'm too positive. I like to see, Native folks smiling and laughing and playing. And so I think that humor was really important, and a vibrancy that we wanted to infuse through all the panels that we were doing. But even in that one, I mean, we figured out, like, we writers room the thing. We were kind of like spinning ideas about this joke of like, she's just sweating and the sweat is pouring off. It's so hard. And then she comes up and it's really tiny. It was one of my favorite jokes, like that I've written, like that Michael wrote, but that, that has been written with like Native comics in mind. I think the other part that I really appreciated about those panels was an understanding of how our past traditions are carried on and continue to be carried on. Wampum is so critically important to people, all along the coasts, because it is so delicate and so fragile and so beautiful. And you need just this specific shell piece that comes in, and the drilling that has to go into it, and the work that has to go into it. So we wanted to showcase the work and how, not only technical, but how intricate, how delicate it is to be able to create these incredible works that are so significant and meaningful to the community. Wampum represents familial ties, treaty obligations, land rights, diplomatic connections, trade, as well as economics, right? And economic values and resources and beauty, the aesthetic. So I think all of that is captured with Wampum and showing how it's not something that's buried in the past, and it's not something that's like this whole this mystique around Native people, like, oh, Native people doing something mystical with Wampum. It's like there's a little place that they do it. If you read the stuff around it, like we learned that you have to come into it with a good heart, which I absolutely loved as part of the story. So was it Star Wars, right? They show Star Wars on repeat. Working in the space because everybody loves it, puts everybody in a good mood, and you come at it with this, with a good heart and a good spirit. And I think all of that was really compelling about understanding Native identity and concepts and how we move forward.
Thank you so much. Michael and Lee, is there anything else as we wrap up our conversation around representation that you want to share before we conclude?
I think that Dr. Francis has said really what I wanted to, but I'll go back to what I said as I wrote the book. Really, what I wanted to punch home was the most important thing we can do as Indigenous people is create these stories ourselves. And Dr. Francis and I had the privilege of working with NMAI and others. And quite frankly, as he was talking, being able to workshop some of these ideas and go, hey, we need to put some humor in this. Here's why. I'm very thankful to the team at the Smithsonian and elsewhere. Like, we're very receptive of that, understood, allowed us to, make the comic really ours. And that's the most important to me, is making sure that we're telling our own stories.
And I think that lends itself to, in some ways, continuing to create more space for Native voices to tell those stories, to tell those community-based stories, and not continue to essentialize around a set of characters or iconography that is so prevalent in modern Western society, right? So this idea of the Plains Native, and that is no disrespect to my Plains relatives, but there is a Western bias in this country that centralizes around sort of this Plains, Pueblo, Navajo region, this Rocky Mountain line, that is where we turn all our attention to, and yet here's Native New York, right? Here's this incredible, stories of people that have passed through for thousands of years, that have made their homes, all along throughout Manhattan, all the way up to the Great Lakes. Tales that are sad, that are difficult, tales that are amazing, and speak to the adaptability, the survivability, all of these amazing things that make Native folks. And I think that's what we want to get at with the representation. It's not the tragic chief, riding away into the sunset on the back of his pony. It is the vibrancy and the brilliance of Native peoples, Native and Indigenous peoples all across Turtle Island, and what they have been able to bring and what they continue to bring forward. And the more that we're able to tell those stories from our localities, from our regions, the more we get to, we get more stories. I was like, there's always room for stories, right? So there's always room for that. So we get more compelling stories, and we get to learn more about people in these spaces, and we get to have, just these beautiful understandings that continue to bring out, the value of Indigenous thoughts and ways of being and knowing.
Well said. And I have to say, I really love the fact that your work on this exhibition that exists in New York can now be spread out across the country through resources like MK360, and kind of land in many different places to learn about folks from New York and beyond. So thank you so much for your words today and sharing your thoughts and experience. I guess that wraps up our conversation for part 1. I'm really looking forward to our next conversation for part 2. Thank you so much to Lee and Michael for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, hey, thanks everybody.
Before we wrap up for the day, please take a moment to fill out our evaluation. A link will be placed in the chat. And in closing, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Many thanks to Lee and Michael for such an interesting conversation. And thank you for Jen for moderating. All resources and more will be sent in a follow-up email. In next week's session, July 18th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll again be talking with Michael and Lee, but we'll dive more deeply into difficult topics with comics and graphic novels, and you'll learn about the exciting projects and work that they have upcoming. Thank you, and have a good night.